So your survey reflects growing interest in Africa, but still a misunderstood continent for investment.
That's right. You know, we've been tracking the trends of foreign direct investment since last year in our inaugural survey. And this year we've seen that there's been a growth from 4.5% to 5.5% of global FDI projects are actually in Africa. So there's been growth. But it's still well below what equivalent places like China or India are getting. So our view is that Africa is still not getting its fair share of global FDI.
Before you go further, how does the survey work? Just so we know where this is coming from and who contributes to it and what the measures are.
So what we've done is really speak to 500 investors from around the world. These would be chief financial officers, CEOs of large companies who have investments around the world, including on the African continent themselves. So these are the people that move the markets.
Right. Okay. Look at the trends now in terms of money. You talk about the number of deals now, presumably, or investments. That would be small deals and big ones. What sort of money are we talking here?
Well, our expectation is that over a period of years, up to 2015, Africa should attract about $150 billion of foreign direct investment on an annual basis. Now, that's a critical number that Africa is tracking towards. But the reality is, when you talk about capital, from 2010 to 2011, FDI capital is actually reduced, but projects have increased. This is a trend around the world. It's really a lingering reaction of the financial crisis. What's interesting, though, is despite the drop in capital, the level of projects in Africa, no doubt, have grown. It's grown by 27% on a year-on-year basis. Now, the key message out of that is that we're seeing far larger number of smaller projects, which is going into diversification of the economy across Africa. So far greater investments into the services sector, construction, financial services, away from the obvious natural resources.
Africa's a big place. It can't be evenly distributed. So where do you find most interest is?
Well, there's no doubt that when you look at it, South Africa continues to attract the lion's share of foreign direct investment. In fact, if you took the 54 countries in Africa, about 15 countries make up 85% of all foreign direct investment, or that's provide the home for foreign direct investment. The big markets are South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya. What's interesting, though, is that looking at investments into Africa, South Africa actually ranks number 6 in the world of intra-Africa foreign direct investment. So it continues to play a leading role in driving investment in the continent.
That's interesting. We think there's not enough investment in South Africa and we need much more, but your survey suggesting it's still substantial.
Well, to your earlier point about looking at the continent, the reality is it's a patchwork of 54 countries, and this makes it a complex investment proposition for global investors. What Africa needs is greater regional economic hubs. So our survey really points out two areas: greater regional economic communities and greater investment in infrastructure. The most exciting news, I think, is the commitment by 26 member states in Africa to form this Pan-African tripartite free trade zone, which is a market of about 600 million people, $1 trillion in GDP. The only markets bigger than that would be China and India in population terms. Well, now that's exciting.
Let's talk about that. And you do say that China and India are attracting much more. What are the factors that, I mean, you might have negative factors where people see huge risk in a place, but you might have a lack of positive factors. In other words, they just don't know enough about it. Whereas India and China, you'd think that for other investors from other places, they would also be ignorance or a hesitancy. But it appears that Africa needs to do more to sell itself.
I think you're absolutely right there. In fact, what we looked at is there was a marked difference between people who are already invested in Africa and their view of the continent and people who are not. In fact, people who have a business presence in Africa rank Africa ahead of all places in the world, all regions in the world, in terms of market attractiveness, bar Asia, and by a small margin only. For those people who don't have a business on the continent, in fact, rank Africa dead last. So there's a massive perception gap, and that perceptions are really influenced by views around political stability, corruption, ease of doing business. What we did also is try to understand, why is that so? What, is there fact that supports some of these perceptions? And there's no doubt, if you look at levels of progress, let's take political stability. If you go back to the 90s, to today, in a 20-year period, the level of democracy or democratization across Africa has grown exponentially. In fact, in 1990...
There are questions, though, about how genuine it is.
Well,
elections which are held which perhaps are not real.
Well, in 1990, up to that point, we only had one successful democratic handover of power. Post that, we've had many democratic elections, but we've had 30 power handovers in that period. We've had an election in Nigeria. You've had a successful transition in Zambia. The reality is there's been gains, but that story is not being told. If we look at the ease of doing business, perhaps, and that's another factor that has come up.
That's not about huge risk, but it's about, as you say, just getting in and doing the job.
Understanding the regulations. The complexity that comes with 54 countries is 54 sets of rules, regulations that are not harmonized, which is why we're supporters of the free trade area. But even in the current circumstance, there are more than half a dozen African countries that rank ahead of India, China, Brazil on ease of doing business. In fact, more than 30 African countries rank ahead of Russia in Transparency International's corruption index. But that story is not getting out there. And we think a more joined up approach between business and government is what's needed to tell that story.
We'll have to stop there. It is a fascinating story. That was Ajen Sita, CEO of Ernst and Young Africa.